In the darkest part of the night, in the first hours of August 2nd, 1964, the American destroyer USS Maddox was providing both intelligence and support to units of the South Vietnamese Navy in the Gulf of Tonkin, 20 miles or so off the coast of North Vietnam. At 3:20, the captain of the Maddox, John Herrick, learned through radio intercepts that the North Vietnamese were scrambling their fleet of PT boats. By itself, this was less than alarming because the Maddox was in international waters. Still, to avoid a confrontation, Herrick ordered the Maddox to turn seaward away from the coast. He resumed his patrol the next morning and continued to cruise north off the North Vietnamese coast. That afternoon, at about 3 o'clock, his ship's radar picked up the blips of several fast-moving surface vessels, almost certainly North Vietnamese torpedo boats, headed in his direction. As a precaution, he called for support from the American aircraft carrier Ticonderoga, some 250 miles to the southeast. An hour later, as the PT boats approached, Herrick fired several warning shots, but without effect. And at 3,000 yards, the North Vietnamese boats launched torpedoes. None hit. But since the Maddox was now under attack, Herrick ordered his gunners to fire for effect. The ship's 5-inch guns banged out a series of quick volleys that damaged one of the boats and sent the others fleeing. Soon afterward, a plane from the Ticonderoga arrived overhead and sank the damaged PT boat. The U.S. Pacific Fleet commander, Admiral Tom Moorer, sent a second destroyer, the Turner Joy, to accompany the Maddox, and the patrol continued. Meanwhile, 100 miles to the south, the South Vietnamese Navy conducted another attack on the North Vietnamese coast. Neither the Maddox nor the Turner Joy was involved in that attack, but the North Vietnamese apparently concluded that their presence was somehow connected, and they again scrambled their PT boat squadron. From this point on, events are shrouded in confusion and mystery. On the night of August 4th, the radar on both ships reported several small surface contacts. At 10:39 p.m., the Turner Joy opened fire on one of the contacts. The conditions were less than optimal. Visibility was near zero, and Herrick himself reported that overeager sonar men may have accounted for many reports. Planes from the Ticonderoga failed to make a visual sighting, so it is possible that this second attack in the Gulf of Tonkin was actually a phantom. Many years later, when the war in Vietnam had become a hotly contested political issue, many insisted that it had never happened. Whether or not that was the case, the events in the Tonkin Gulf on August 2nd and 4th had enormous significance, for they triggered what was called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It authorized President Lyndon Johnson to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. Well, who could vote against that? Almost no one, it turns out. It passed the House unanimously, and there were only 2 dissenting votes in the Senate. Only in hindsight did it become evident that the vague wording of that resolution gave President Johnson virtual carte blanche to do anything he deemed necessary, including fighting a war halfway around the world without any further congressional oversight. Passed on August 7th, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution marked the beginning of active American participation in the Vietnam War. Vietnam is a beautiful country with white, pristine beaches along a 2,000-mile coast, lush tropical lowlands, densely forested mountains. Yet for Americans of a certain age, the very word Vietnam triggers frustration, futility, and sadness. The war fractured our national consensus and left a palpable scar on our collective psyche. In some ways, it was a product of the Cold War, when American policy decisions, regardless of political party, were dominated by a concern about Soviet and more generally communist aggression. Concern is probably not a strong enough word. Obsession may be more accurate. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, almost every international event was viewed and assessed through the prism of how it impacted the United States' rivalry with the Soviet Union or with Communist China, which most Americans believed to be in cahoots with each other, though that turned out not to be the case. The Soviets were not shy in proclaiming that their goal was to destroy both democracy and capitalism, which they saw as their mortal enemies. In the years since World War II, the Soviet Union had occupied most of Eastern Europe, sponsored a North Korean invasion of South Korea, and sought to plant nuclear missiles in Cuba. American news magazines printed maps showing communist expansion as a growing red stain across the planet. And in the minds of most Americans, this competition was a zero-sum game. That is, any gain by the communists was necessarily a loss to the West, and any gain by the West was a blow to Soviet ambitions. It was essential, therefore, to confront and stop any communist initiative. But some issues did not fit neatly into this communism versus democracy paradigm. In the Middle East, for example, conflicts between Arabs and Israelis had little to do with communism, except that communists, or Westerners for that matter, might support one side or the other. In Africa, regional and even tribal rivalries dominated. Elsewhere, nationalist aspirations bumped up against old colonial empires. And it was this that placed French Indochina at the center of conflict in the 1950s. The provinces of what is now Vietnam, Annam, Tonkin, and Cochin China, had suffered through occupation and exploitation by one country or another for most of their history. China had occupied the area until the mid-19th century, leaving a legacy of hostility that still exists. Then in 1858, French forces arrived. After defeating China in the Sino-French War of 1884-85, France claimed sovereignty over Vietnam, as well as Laos and Cambodia, and renamed it French Indochina. In the 1930s, the Japanese eyed Indochina as a source of raw materials, especially rubber and tin, and in 1940, French Indochina seemed ripe for the picking once more, after Nazi Germany defeated France in a stunning blitzkrieg. U.S. objections to Japan's occupation of Indochina was one of the issues that soured Japanese-American relations and led ultimately to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. During World War II in the Pacific, the indigenous Vietnamese were a kind of American ally, conducting a guerrilla war campaign against the Japanese occupiers. The leader of that fight was a 51-year-old merchant sailor and restaurant cook named Ho Chi Minh, a Vietnamese nationalist who had fought the Chinese, the French, the Japanese, and eventually the Americans. He was also a communist. Ho Chi Minh was first attracted to Marxist teachings as a student in Paris from 1917 to 1923. He also studied in Moscow at a time when the Russian Revolution was still young. At the end of the Second World War, Ho announced Vietnamese independence from its French colonial masters using language he borrowed from the American Declaration of Independence. Yet because Ho was a communist, Americans viewed him through a Cold War lens, and when the French announced their determination to resurrect their overseas empire and reclaim Indochina, the United States supported that ambition. Consequently, Ho and his followers simply shifted from fighting the Japanese to fighting the French, and they accepted aid from both Soviet Russia and Communist China, which only helped confirm Americans in their perception of Ho as part of the broader Cold War struggle. A turning point occurred in 1954, when a large element of Ho's Revolutionary Army surrounded a force of some 10,000 French soldiers at the North Vietnamese village of Dien Bien Phu. The French appealed to the United States for military support, but President Dwight Eisenhower wouldn't do it. The United States, he insisted, would not go to war to sustain a French colonial empire. The French garrison at Dien Bien Phu surrendered, and that led to negotiations in Geneva, Switzerland, to end the conflict. The delegates in Geneva divided Indochina into 3 separate and independent countries: Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The problem was that there were 2 contending factions, each claiming to be the rightful government of Vietnam: Ho Chi Minh's communists in the north, and an anti-communist government in the south under Ngo Dinh Diem, which was backed by the United States. The Geneva Protocols divided Vietnam in half at the 17th parallel, the idea being that this would be a temporary division and that a general election held later would unify the country under one government. The United States hoped and expected that the Vietnamese would choose democracy and capitalism rather than communism and totalitarianism. We will never know because the election was never held. Cynics say that the United States and the South Vietnamese blocked it, fearing that the popular Ho Chi Minh would win. So, as in Korea, 2 separate and rival governments emerged: a pro-Western South and a communist North. For the next 10 years, the 2 sides engaged in a constant low-grade conflict, with the United States providing aid, including military aid, to the South Vietnamese. Then the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August of 1964 brought the United States fully into the war. U.S. participation would last more than 9 years and result in more than 210,000 American casualties, including 58,209 killed. It was mostly a ground war, and much of the fighting took place in thick jungle between small groups. But there were also a number of large-scale battles, especially along the so-called demilitarized zone, or DMZ, at the 17th parallel. North Vietnamese efforts to break through that line led to major battles at Con Thien and Khe Sanh. Though American ground troops of both the Army and the Marine Corps won a number of remarkable victories, few of them produced strategic success. For instance, in the 1968 Battle of Khe Sanh in Quang Tri Province, the 26th U.S. Marine Regiment held off 2 full North Vietnamese divisions for 9 weeks, inflicting more than 10,000 casualties while losing only 205 killed and 800 wounded. But in the end, the Marines had to evacuate the site anyway. While the Marines fought ashore, Navy aircraft carriers conducted operations from offshore, especially from what was called Yankee Station near the Gulf of Tonkin. Besides providing tactical air support for the troops on the ground, they played a major role in the years-long bombing campaign against the North. At first, the United States tried to calibrate its bombing of the North based on enemy action in the hope that it would further demonstrate that aggression only brought more punishment. For example, when Communist forces attacked the American airbase at Pleiku in February of 1965, the United States retaliated by sending 83 planes from 3 Navy carriers to attack the North Vietnamese base at Dong Ha. This kind of tit-for-tat bombing, however, did not seem to have any appreciable effect on enemy behavior. Consequently, in March of that year, the U.S. began a full-scale bombing campaign dubbed Operation Rolling Thunder. The goal was to inflict steadily increasing pain on the enemy in the expectation that at some point the North Vietnamese would cry uncle and agree to negotiate. That never happened. And meanwhile, American planes from both the carriers offshore and Air Force bases in South Vietnam dropped thousands of tons of bombs on North Vietnam. The campaign not only failed to convince the enemy to give up, it may actually have given them more leverage. Here's why. Over the 9 years of war, the United States lost more than 3,700 aircraft over North Vietnam and 2,000 American airmen. When an American pilot ejected, he was sometimes able to make his way to friendly forces, but many were made prisoner. Among these were Commander, later Admiral James Stockdale, who attributed his ability to survive the brutal conditions of incarceration in what was called the Hanoi Hilton by relying on his study of the Stoic philosophers and Epictetus in particular. Another was John McCain, the son and grandson of admirals who emerged from the ordeal physically crippled but unbroken. By 1970, the North Vietnamese held more than 1,300 U.S. servicemen, most of them pilots and aircrew. And as the number of American POWs increased, pressure grew on the U.S. government to do something to obtain their release. 2 other aspects of the Navy's role in Vietnam were central to the conflict. First, in an undertaking dubbed Operation Market Time, Navy vessels operated along the coast to interdict communist supply vessels that were bringing men, equipment, and ammunition into the South along Vietnam's lengthy coastline. The overland Ho Chi Minh Trail, famous as it was, could not fully meet the needs of the communist forces fighting in the South. And the combatants quickly learned that far more supplies and equipment could be sent by sea than was possible in endless caravans and trucks or by bicycle over jungle roads. As in every war, logistics were paramount. Early in the war, the South Vietnamese Navy had spotted a 130-foot trawler imperfectly camouflaged and behaving suspiciously, making its way southward along the coast. After a brisk firefight, the South Vietnamese captured it and found that it was filled with weapons and ammunition. After that, the communists shifted to using small coastal sampans. Because the waters off Vietnam were crowded by literally hundreds of such craft, picking out those worthy of a search was extraordinarily difficult. To conduct the inspections, the U.S. Navy relied heavily on a new type of vessel that was officially dubbed a patrol craft, fast, or PCF, in the Navy's system of acronyms. They had an aluminum hull and drew only 5 feet of water, which allowed them to operate close to shore. They were also fast, a fact that gave rise to their near universal nickname as swift boats. Only 50 feet long, they had a crew of 6, a junior officer in command, often a lieutenant junior grade, a senior petty officer, often a bosun's mate, plus a radar man, an engine man, and 2 gunners. Later, they frequently carried a 7th crew member who was a trainee in the Vietnamese Navy. The armament on these boats consisted of 2 50 caliber machine guns and an 81 millimeter mortar, which means they had a lot of firepower despite their small size. The swift boats, plus Navy destroyers and Coast Guard cutters, maintained an almost continuous patrol from the 17th parallel, where North Vietnam began, down to Cape Cam at the southern tip of South Vietnam in the Gulf of Thailand. But stopping scores of small fishing vessels every day was tedious and frustrating. Typically, an American vessel would pick out a suspicious-looking sampan and order it to stop. Then 2 or 3 men would board it to inspect its cargo. Sometimes they had to reach into piles of fish or sift through a cargo of rice to make sure there were no weapons hidden underneath. Most of the vessels proved to be innocent. Those who were not sometimes tried to escape, and that would result in a firefight when the swift boats overtook them. Success was measured in the number of vessels caught trying to bring in guns or ammunition. Only rarely did market time produce a major triumph. Perhaps the most noteworthy success occurred in 1968, when the North Vietnamese tried to run 4 big trawlers into the south to support the Tet Offensive. All 4 made the attempt on the same night. Spotted by the American patrol vessels, the trawlers tried to escape. 1 turned back. The other 3 were destroyed. Market time did not stop the smuggling of weapons and ammunition into the South, but it did force the communists to be more creative and surreptitious. At the very least, it slowed the resupply effort and put more of a burden on the long and treacherous Ho Chi Minh Trail. Another element of the Navy's role in the Vietnam War was its work on the inland waterways. This had been part of the U.S. Navy's portfolio virtually since its founding. Benedict Arnold's little navy on Lake Champlain, Oliver Hazard Perry's small fleet on Lake Erie, and of course the lengthy and decisive Riverine campaign during the American Civil War all stand as evidence that the Navy's writ runs on freshwater as well as saltwater. In Vietnam, Navy vessels played a critical role in the labyrinth of rivers, waterways, and canals of the Mekong Delta that sprawled across 15,000 square miles southwest of the capital city of Saigon. In this flat and featureless wetland, called the Plain of Reeds, the southward flowing Mekong River breaks into 4 outlets, connected by scores of canals and small waterways winding through the marshy ground. The Vietnamese communists, called Viet Cong or VC in the American parlance, used the swamps and foliage of the Delta as a sanctuary. To disrupt those sanctuaries and break up enemy concentrations, the U.S. Navy initiated what was called Operation Game Warden. Here, too, the Navy relied on small, light vessels, even smaller than the swift boats. Made of fiberglass, they were called PBRs, Patrol Boat River, and had a crew of only 4. A chief or a first-class petty officer in command, plus an engineman, a gunner, and a seaman. Like the swift boats, the PBRs spent a lot of their time stopping and searching suspicious vessels, and they engaged in a remarkable number of firefights. In the 2 years from 1966 to 1968, the PBR sailors of Operation Game Warden participated in more than 700 firefights. That's more than 2 a day. During especially intensive operations in 1968, the overall U.S. Navy commander in Vietnam, Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, initiated Operation Sea Lords to reclaim sections of the Delta from the Viet Cong. He added swift boats to the riverine squadrons, plus armored landing craft that were called monitors in a tribute to Ericsson's Civil War ironclad. Collectively, these ships made up what was called the Mobile Riverine Force. It had a number of signal accomplishments. One of the more spectacular occurred in 1966, when 2 small PBRs stumbled onto a major Viet Cong troop movement involving as many as 50 vessels. The PBRs were commanded by a first-class bosun's mate named James Williams. Assessing the situation, acting on instinct, Williams led his 2 boats, guns blazing, straight into the dozens of armed enemy sampans. Passing through the flotilla, he then turned around and charged through it again. His 2 boats, supported by 2 Navy Sea Wolf helicopters, destroyed more than 50 enemy vessels and wrecked the enemy troop movement. For this, Williams was awarded the Medal of Honor. The U.S. Navy never succeeded in eliminating the Viet Cong presence from the Delta, though Operation Game Warden compelled the enemy to exercise greater caution. By 1968, the American public had grown impatient with the war. President Johnson, who had hoped to focus his administration on domestic issues like civil rights, was frustrated too. So much so that on March 31st, 1968, he announced in a televised address that he would stop the bombing, open negotiations with the North Vietnamese in Paris, and in a stunning surprise, said that he would not run for another term as president. Richard Nixon took office in January 1969, and he was determined to succeed where Johnson had failed. The peace negotiations Johnson had initiated in Paris were stalled by silly arguments over the shape of the negotiating table. Nixon's advisors assured him that ramping up the bombing campaign would force the North to get serious. In 1972, Operation Linebacker replaced Rolling Thunder. Before the war ended, the United States had dropped more than 7.5 million tons of bombs on North Vietnam. That is more than the Allies dropped on Germany in all of World War II. How much of an impact that had on the North Vietnamese is unclear. By now, Nixon and the U.S. simply wanted to find an honorable exit. With negotiations stalled, Nixon ordered more bombing, called Linebacker 2, often referred to as the Christmas bombing. It was so violent, some European governments compared it to the Holocaust. Eventually, the negotiators struck a deal. The United States would withdraw all of its forces from Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese would release all the American POWs. Critics of this agreement insist that all it did was secure what has been called a decent interval, during which Americans could exit the country before the North Vietnamese took over. Nixon and others hoped that with American funding and American weapons, the South Vietnamese would be able to defend themselves for at least a while. Instead, the South Vietnamese army fell apart almost at once, and in 1975, North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon. The United States had gone to war in 1965 in the hope of halting the spread of communism and helping a small country defend itself. Though the United States was the most powerful nation on earth and its Navy virtually unchallenged at sea, the difficulties and ambiguities of fighting a lengthy war in a foreign country thousands of miles away, in a challenging climate, in an unfamiliar culture, against a wily and resourceful enemy caused enormous frustration. In spite of innumerable examples of individual American heroism, sacrifice, and triumph, none of it brought strategic victory. During the peace negotiations, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger reportedly said to his North Vietnamese counterpart, "You know you never beat us in a battle." The North Vietnamese delegate supposedly responded, "That is true. It is also completely irrelevant." The Vietnamese communists had been fighting for more than a quarter century, and they were apparently willing to fight for another quarter century if necessary. The American people were not.